Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I've been doing a great deal of research on this topic in recent years, and as a result, I have produced some detailed studies, and I have shared these with the Academia Ordo Templi Orientis and other forums. But in this talk, I want to give a more wide angle introduction and overview of this general subject, and give some juicy details that I hope will inspire you to do your own reading on these lines. I want to start by discussing my own reader's interest in fiction as a Thelemic magician, as well as the motives and benefits for students in approaching this material. And then we'll spend some time reviewing relevant, perhaps not always important, books of fiction for Thelema in particular. Let me touch here on my criteria for the survey. References to occultism are so common in modern fiction that it's necessary to narrow the field somewhat in order to be useful in discussion. And I'll be looking at works that actually contributed to Crowley's teachings or to the origins of O.T.O, or which show the specific influence of these, often communicated through the agency of Crowley's key students. For our purposes here, I'm not interested in the many books which simply use Crowley's public personality as a convenient fictional character, typically a villain. After my discussion of these other works, I will read a brief excerpt from my own work of fiction, Erotopharmakohymnia Onorio. So I should start with a confession. There was a stretch of some years, nearly amounting to a decade in my late 20s and early 30s, in which I read hardly any fiction at all. As an aspiring magician, I read philosophy, psychology, history, comparative religion and symbolism, and many other books where, if the facts were not necessarily accurate, the premise was at least an attempt to discuss the factual world without inventing people or situations. In retrospect, I feel this was a terrible error. When I returned to reading literary and fantastic fiction, I realized that it affords an opportunity to learn different sorts of things and to learn differently than expository works of so-called nonfiction can manage. Crowley also seems to have thought as much. When he developed the preliminary course of reading for AA, he included as section 2 other books, principally fiction of a generally suggestive and helpful kind. And I will touch on at least a couple of the books from his list in the course of this overview. The AA curriculum was originally published in the appendices to Magic and Theory and Practice, and the most recent and authoritative edition of it appears in the single-volume Magic Book 4. Taking a cue from Crowley, my own book, Thelema for the People, has among its bibliographies an annotated listing of inspirational fiction, and I will definitely bring up a number of these works in this discussion. Still, in this survey, I won't be covering all of Crowley's reading list or my own, and I will range beyond them in order to address historical and literary points. Crowley went out of his way to publish fiction in both of the periodicals over which he had editorial control. The Equinox would have broken new ground even if it had only been an occult journal, but Crowley included not only his own fiction, but that of many other authors. He pointed to the story The Magic Glasses by Frank Harris in the first number of the Equinox as an epitome of scientific Illuminism. The fiction in the Equinox was not just padding, it was tied into the instructional agenda of the journal. Crowley also claimed to have rehabilitated through his editorship the International from its ruin as a World War I German propaganda organ in the hands of George Sylvester Fireck. Crowley called it, quote, originally the organ of pure literature, the only one in the United States of any authority, end quote. And he continued to use Fireck's German funding to publish 16 of his own stories, along with other worthwhile fiction during what became the magazine's final year. Now, it's no accident that Crowley, along with occultists before and since, invested significant efforts into creating fiction. The demands on the imaginative faculty, the presentation of ideas in the form of narrative, the subtleties of character voice and subjective construction, all of these are at a premium in effective fiction and they are also essential ingredients of occult magic. In addition, for initiates bound by obligations of secrecy, fiction supplies a way to write about our experiences so that only those who are likewise instructed will be able to sort out fact from fancy. I would suggest that these are the reasons we find occultists often writing fiction and notably reading it. So let's get to the tour here. I'll be offering this survey in 3 chronological phases. The first is trained on the 19th century. Modern occultism is a peculiar cultural innovation of the long 19th century, which, for reasons I hope you'll appreciate, I take as ending in 1904. The French original of the word occultism, that is, l'occultisme, dates to 1842. By 1856, Eliphas Levi had embraced it as a label for his work, and a number of other authors followed suit. As far as organizational forms are concerned, this period saw the development of various forms of neo-Gnosticism, the proliferation and systemization of Masonic Hograd, the rise and fall of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the creation of the Theosophical Society, Neo-Rosicrucianism among French symbolists and in the English Golden Dawn, and others. Our Gnostic Catholic saint, Gerard Ancos, or Papou, has been called the Balzac of occultism, owing to his prodigious output. But that seems unfair to me. Surely Balzac was the Balzac of occultism. He was evidently a personal acquaintance of Eliphas Levi. More importantly, he wrote several novels with esoteric themes that became doctrinally important to occultists. And chief among these was Seraphita. This short novel is a classic of supernatural literature. It is well worth a read, although the opening passages are slow and I would say off-putting. After a long-drawn meditation on Norwegian geography, the reader reaches the 3rd chapter, which includes a fairly detailed introduction to Emanuel Swedenborg's life and work. And that part could be interesting to those unfamiliar with this topic, but it can be skimmed without loss by those familiar with it. The book ends with an unusual and spectacular mystical vision. It imagines a sexual mysticism incorporating an androgynous ideal. This book appears to have been influential on the doctrine of blending that was later formulated by Paschal Beverly Randolph and transmitted by the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. I would suggest that Seraphita also provides important cultural background for both the Baphomet of Eliphas Levi and that of O.T.O. For an example of why I see Thelemic resonances in this book, take this passage, quote, "God welcomes boldness. He loves to be taken by violence. He will never reject those who force their way to him. Know this, desire, the torrent of your will, is so all-powerful that a single emission of it, made with force, can obtain all. A single cry uttered under the pressure of faith suffices. Be one of such beings, full of force, of will, of love. Be conquerors on the earth." Now, the artist Paul Gauguin, venerated by Crowley, referenced Seraphita in a note with a drawing of his own ceramic sculpture, Oviri. The inscription translates as, "And the monster, embracing its creation, filled her generous womb with seed and fathered Seraphitus Seraphita." Now, to go across the English Channel here, Bulwer Lytton's novel, Zanoni, romanticized Rosicrucianism for 19th century readers, and it became a staple of occultist bookshelves. It tells the story of a Rosicrucian adept in the 18th century whose use of the elixir of life has sustained him since the ancient Babylonian Empire, and who ultimately sacrifices his magical immortality. Zanoni refers to the adept's holy guardian angel or personal genius as Adonai, a usage later adopted by both Anna Kingsford and Aleister Crowley, among others. Golden Dawn founder MacGregor Mathers first became interested in the occult after reading Zanoni. and he used Zanoni as a nickname. His wife and close friends called him Zan in conversation. Zanoni also depicts an ordeal involving a spiritual guardian of the threshold. Madame Blavatsky would evolve this phrase into the dweller of the threshold, specifically citing Zanoni, and she affirmed the reality of the phenomenon, also referencing, quote, Porphyry and other philosophers, unquote, regarding its nature. Blavatsky was so taken with the occult descriptions in Zanoni that the first volume of her Isis Unveiled quotes the novel for more than a full page. After which she comments, "Such is the insufficient sketch of elemental beings void of divine spirit, given by one whom many with reason believed to know more than he was prepared to admit in the face of an incredulous public." Unquote. Now, Crowley later took up this thread in Liber Cordis Sancti Serpente, chapter 4, verse 34. On the threshold stood the fulminant figure of evil. In his commentary, he relates this figure explicitly to Zanoni's exposition of, quote, the evil persona, the dweller on the threshold, portrayed sensationally for the trade by Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, unquote. On the left side of this slide, you can see a painting by Theosophist Reginald W. Machell from about 1895. It's titled The Dweller on the Threshold, and it was probably intended to illustrate the relevant passage from Zanoni, but it might simply be a mystical allegory for theosophical doctrine. One could, in fact, do an entire study just concerned with the survival and adaptation of this dweller on the threshold characterization of the evil genius for the last century and a half in literature and esoteric doctrine. In 1911, Robert Hitchens used the phrase as the title for his novel about spiritualism. And the next year, Rudolf Steiner entitled the third of his mystery dramas, The Guardian of the Threshold, going back to the original phrasing of Bulwer-Lytton. And in 1945, August Derleth coined his own variant, The Lurker at the Threshold, for the title of his weird horror novel, also attaching H.P. Lovecraft as an alleged co-author, since Derleth had posthumously plundered some of the deceased Lovecraft's unpublished notes while writing the book. Although Blavatsky and Crowley both attributed occultist insider knowledge to Bulwer-Lytton, Pascal Beverly Randolph's Ravelette is actually the first book on my list to have been written by an esoteric organizer, the head of the Brotherhood of Euless and the first founder of American Rosicrucianism. Randolph refers to Bulwer-Lytton as one of the quote-unquote paper stainers who had written about the Order of the Rosy Cross. Clearly presented in the style and format of a fictional novel, Ravelette is nevertheless full of autobiographical detail. Randolph writes in the voice of an anonymous editor, telling tales of himself in the third person as a mysterious and glamorous Rosicrucian personage named Beverly, whose adventures are full of characters and multiple identities. He represents spiritualists as deluded by elemental spirits that pose falsely as spirits of the dead, a doctrine later endorsed by the Theosophical Society and other 19th century occultists. The novel climaxes with a long-anticipated episode in which Beverly is made to undergo the sacred slumber of Sialam Boagie, a trance in which he utters assorted prophecies. This sleep of Sialam recurs in Randolph's occult instructions, and seems to have been taken up from there by the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, along with mentions in Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled. It is evidently the same, quote, infinite sleep and lucid, the sleep of Shiloam, in Liber Cordis Sancti Serpente, although Crowley's contacts with Randolph's teachings were mediated by paratheosophical transmissions. Ravelette explicitly allows for the sort of immortality described in Zanoni, but the novel is premised on an epic tale of reincarnation, where Beverly is redeeming and accomplishing the work of ages through a series of embodiments on the material plane. It fits into a microgenre of reincarnation romance that became very popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Ravelette is also a seminal instance of fictionalized occult autobiography. Later examples of this include Maria Naglowska's Sacred Rite of Magical Love and Franz Bardon's Frabato the Magician. Franz Hartmann was, of course, a famous theosophist and one of the founding adepts of O.T.O. He wrote a number of pieces of fiction, but the one I want to treat here is his Adventure Among the Rosicrucians. This book has a somewhat confused edition history. As best I can determine, it was originally published in English out of Boston in 1887. The first German edition was in 1901 under the title Unter den Adepten und Rosenkreuzern. And the cover image on the left here is a later German edition from the 1960s that dropped the article from the title. A second English edition purporting to be translated from German was issued in 1910 under the title With the Adepts. The book attributes its concealed retreat of adepts to the work of the Brothers of the Gold and Rosy Cross, an actual initiatory order of the 18th century, and it associates with them an historically extant mystical tome, The Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians, of which Hartmann was to produce the first English translation. In fact, the original edition of Hartmann's Adventure Among the Rosicrucians might be read as little more than an elaborate advertisement for Cosmology or the Universal Science of 1888, which he must have had in preparation by then. Throughout With the Adepts, it's clear that the author's preoccupation is with the possibility of establishing a secluded spiritual community, which he terms a Rosicrucian convent. In the appendix added to the second edition, he claims to have begun this work in Switzerland, although he sounds a clear note of discouragement, saying, "It has not yet been finally decided whether this undertaking will be a success or a failure, but the latter is more than probable, as the method of thinking in old, dilapidated, and dying Europe is too narrow-minded to permit of grasping such an exalted idea." But he had in fact taken material steps towards this goal by issuing a prospectus and forming a joint stock company in the late 1880s. But by 1910, it's a little strange to see him still holding out any hope at all for the venture. And yet, the site was close to where Theodor Reuss would eventually establish his O.T.O, a national grand lodge, Verita Mystica, at Ascona, Switzerland, perhaps in some measure posthumously answering Hartmann's aspirations. On the strength of this context, it seems likely that the emphasis on profess houses in early plans and constitutive documents of O.T.O may reflect Hartmann's distinctive contribution to the germinal synthesis of esoteric motives in the order. Indeed, Aleister Crowley's much later paper on the governing of profess houses, of Eden and the Sacred Oak, takes for its central metaphor the one introduced here by Hartmann in the voice of the alchemist adept Theodorus. Hartmann writes, "Could not they establish a garden where the divine lotus flower of wisdom might grow and unfold its leaves, sheltered against the storms of passion raging beyond the walls, watered by the water of truth, whose spring is within, where the tree of life could unfold without becoming encumbered by the weeds of credulity and error, where the soul could breathe the pure spiritual air, unadulterated by the odor of the poison tree of ignorance, unmixed with the effluvia of decaying superstitions, a place where this tree of life, springing from the roots of the tree of knowledge, could grow and spread its branches far up in the invisible realm where wisdom resides, and produce fruits which cause those who partake of them to become like gods and immortal?" When Jory-Karl Huysmans wrote Là-bas, he was already notorious for his seminal novel of French decadence, Au Rebord. Là-bas introduces Huysmans' autobiographical protagonist, Durtal, as a medievalist antiquarian. In the course of his researches into the 15th century diabolist Gilles de Rais, Durtal becomes aware of and then infiltrates a modern Satanist sect. This book was a great success. Its sale was banned in French railway stations. The arch-Satanist featured in the book, Canon Docre, was based by Huysmans on a clergyman from Bruges, while an opposed character, the mystic Dr. Johannes, was modeled on the heretic priest Joseph-Antoine Boulan. When Huysmans met him, Boulan had recently assumed the governance of a neo-Gnostic sect, first organized by Eugène Vintrah. Huysmans had networked among the occultists of his day, including Gerard Uncos and his Neo-Martinist set, and others associated with the Kabbalistic Rose-Croix of Peladon. But he alienated himself from all of these when he unwittingly chose sides in the ongoing feud between Boulan and the Neo-Rosicrucians, with the latter chiefly represented by Stanislas de Goita and Oswald Wirth. Involving himself in this scene, Huysmans experienced a delicious paranoia that the novel communicates beautifully. Boulan died in 1893, and Huysmans' friend, Jules Bois, accused the Paris Rosicrucians of having magically assassinated him. 5 years after the publication of Là-bas, Arthur Edward Waite wrote that Monsieur Huysmans has given currency to the question of Lucifer, has promoted it from obscurity to prominence, and has made it the vogue of the moment. That moment, of course, was the acme of the Palladist conspiracy theory of Leo Taxil, which postulated an elite of satanic sex fiends at the heart of global Freemasonry. A generation later, when Crowley issued his Section 2 reading list, he called Là-bas an account of the extravagances caused by the sin complex. In addition, I should point out, it is valuable for its sardonic humor, its intuitions about certain features of Eucharistic magic, and its veiled references to certain historical antecedents of our EGC rite. The first half of the 20th century is a rich period for supernatural fiction, often with relevance to actual esoteric work. This treatment, of course, will be far from exhaustive, and I will focus on authors more than individual works. Even then, I will have to skip many of genuine interest. Leaving aside Crowley's other accomplishments and the time available bids we must, he was a fairly prolific author of fiction. At his death, many of his stories were still unpublished, and most were uncollected from the journals or other books in which they had appeared. This situation wasn't properly remedied until the 21st century, which saw the publication of the 2 volumes from Wordsworth Editions shown here. I believe both are still in print in affordable paperback. Readers who inspect the publication details will also note that O.T.O, which provided the texts and editorial work in return for a nominal royalty, suggests that a future hardcover version may be published and sold by the order. The extremely wide assortment of stories in The Drug and others includes some with a double role as technical instruction in magic or significant mythopoeia for Thelemic culture. These include Liber 45, The Wake World, a Kabbalistic fairy tale. Liber 61, Tian Dao, a political and psychological parable. Liber 51, Atlantis, the Lost Continent, an antediluvian mystery. And Liber 59, Across the Gulf, a tale of Ankh of Nakhonsu in ancient Egypt. Many of the stories with contemporary settings and conventional narrative style feature actual persons and anecdotes from Crowley's life, only superficially fictionalized. This story with a key tendency is just as pronounced in the Simon If stories of the 2nd volume. If is Crowley's crime-solving mystic and psychologist who first appeared in the pages of the International. And this book includes 23 If tales, most of them unpublished during Crowley's lifetime. It also includes the other formal series of stories by Crowley, Golden Twigs. These twigs are all inspired by themes drawn from Fraser's Golden Bough, and they are both excellent reading and magically instructive. Simon If continues as a central character in Moonchild, Crowley's first written novel. This 1918 composition wasn't published until 11 years later, by which time Crowley had already taken to cataloging it among his magical writings as Liber 81, The Butterfly Net. This book is full of unflattering and comic portrayals of Crowley's acquaintances from his Golden Dawn period, and these are not hard to detect for readers familiar with his biography and that history. In a prefatory note, he wrote, "Need I add that, as the book itself demonstrates beyond all doubt, all persons and incidents are purely the figment of a disordered imagination. Indeed we are. Indeed we are. Crowley's other novel, the second written and first published, is Diary of a Drug Fiend. He conceived of this book when he was having difficulty securing a publisher for his memoirs, proposing that he could instead write a sensationalistic novel to capitalize on the then current drug scare. To his surprise, an editor took him up on the offer and paid him a substantial advance. Crowley then produced the full manuscript in a single month. This book includes an idealized account of Crowley's Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, with Crowley's own role vested in a character called King Lammas. Some of the details of the story's events in the community at Telepolis are of practical and even liturgical relevance to O.T.O work, such as the Gnostic Mass. The novel was very consciously written as an advertisement for the Thelemic movement. An unusual feature is the structure proceeding through three sections: Paradiso, Inferno, and Purgatorio. These, of course, are the books of Dante's Divina Commedia, but in a different sequence. Certainly, Heaven, then Hell, then the work of redemption is a better map of the sequence of events in Drug Fiend, but I suspect that the all-too-literate Crowley may also have intended the book's trajectory to point to the final part of Dante's Purgatorio, the end of Canto 32, which reads, "Firm as a rock upon a mountain high, seated upon it, there appeared to me a shameless whore with eyes swift glancing round, and, as if not to have her taken from him, upright beside her I beheld a giant, and ever and anon they kissed each other." This image of the Scarlet Woman and the Beast would not have been lost on Crowley. Crowley first became aware of James Branch Cabell when the Virginian author's philosophical and critical work Beyond Life was sent to him, evidently by H.L. Mencken. Crowley wrote a warm review, which he sent to Cabell before publication, along with a copy of the All Drama number 3 of volume 12 of the International, which included the first publication of Crowley's Gnostic Mass. Cabell then used a paraphrased version of the Mass as chapter 22 of Jürgen, his new novel about the amorous adventures of a pawnbroker in the lands of myth and fable. That chapter in particular became grounds for the attempt to suppress the book, an attempt which both failed in the courts and secured Cabell's fame in the larger public. Crowley and Cabell corresponded for many years. In his confessions, Crowley wrote, "I have been accused of exaggerated enthusiasm for Cabell," and this is small wonder considering that he called Cabell at once the most ambitious and the best worth study of living authors, as well as undoubtedly the greatest philosopher as well as magician that has ever arisen in America. In the 1924 essay, The Way of Wizardry, Cabell described magicking in suitable estate as the proper method for authors of fiction, who should burn appropriate perfumes, wear carefully selected regalia, and decorate their writing chambers according to high and approved old formulae. Cabell continued to show well-informed allusions to occultism all through his entertaining novels, published throughout the first half of the century. The High Place, for instance, published soon after Jürgen in 1923, riffs on both the Sleeping Beauty and Faust legends. Through the gallant dream of Florian de Puissange, it uses its two seminal legends to put pagan and Christian religion into hilarious comparisons with each other, as well as a terrific culminating chapter with a conversation between the Archangel Michael and Cabell's pan-Satan figure, Janico. Florian is conspicuously free of the ravages of moral conscience, a feature which distinguishes him slightly from the book's second most entertaining character, the pagan high priest come Christian saint Hoprig. The later novel, Something About Eve, from 1927, features a philandering hero who gives his mortal life over to a spirit in order to be free of the consequences of his previous adulteries. As a result, he is dispatched into the astral and spiritual realms, where he has adventures illustrating solar phallic theories of religion and Cabell's own ideas about the origins of creativity. The Devil's Own Dear Son, in 1949, was Cabell's 50th book and final novel, still in fine form with occult references and clever satire. Gustav Meyrink was just 7 years Crowley's senior. Each was aware of the other's work, but I've found no evidence of any personal meeting between the two. In correspondence, Meyrink expressed some distaste and antagonism for both Crowley and Royce, with whom he would have had a great number of mutual acquaintances. Meyrink was supposedly initiated into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in London. An 1893 letter from Wynne Westcott is cited as evidence for this claim. In 1891, Meyrink had participated in founding a theosophical body in Prague called the Blue Star, and in the following period he had connections to Franz Hartmann. He also professed an affiliation to the ancient and primitive rite of Freemasonry, which likely involved contact with John Yarker. In 1897, he joined an Illuminati order that may have been the revival engineered by Royce and Engel 2 years earlier. He also appears to have had some connection to the HB of L. Like the other early theosophists, as well as Crowley, Meyrink combined a practice of Western occult traditions with Eastern mysticism, yoga, and other techniques. He was interested in both European and Taoist alchemy and experimented with psychotropic drugs. Meyrink started writing short fiction, weird tales, and satires in 1901, but his first novel, Der Golem, was published in 1914, and it remains his most famous. It is set in Prague, which is also the setting for half his later novels. It contains autobiographical features and, like all of his novels, draws on actual visionary experiences that the author cultivated and achieved. The Golem was first translated into English in 1928, early enough for H.P. Lovecraft to read it and be impressed by it. Meyrink's second novel, Das grüne Gesicht, The Green Face, is set in Amsterdam, and it takes for its mythic backdrop the legend of the Wandering Jew, just as the Golem legend had provided a foundation for his earlier book. But Meyrink was neither a folklorist nor a religious propagandist. His literary skill serves to give the reader a sense of the tenuousness of mundane events and places that we must consent to call real. And he captured the apocalyptic zeitgeist of the early decades of the new eon. Walpurgisnacht is set in Prague during World War I. The narrative is impressionistic and mysterious, full of portents and wry observations. There's a long soliloquy from Lucifer in chapter 7, supplying theological insight on a par with the similar exposition of Janico in Cabble's High Place. But it goes further in providing a glimpse of important magical doctrine. A technique of occult domination of the personality is important to the plot of this novel, but one of its fascinating features is the ambivalence of agency in such transactions. To what extent are those manipulating others themselves psychic puppets? This supernatural conundrum meshes perfectly in the novel with the moribund persistence of social custom and the horrors of violent revolution. Meyrink's fourth novel, Der Weiße Dominikaner, in English, The White Dominican, is generally considered to be his least in the view of literary critics. But as a magician, I find it to be perhaps his best. It is in the form of The Revelations of Christopher Dovecote, a man in a small, unnamed Bavarian town undergoing a series of visionary episodes. It offers little in the way of a plot resolution, but rather ends with the intensification of and insistence on its central enigmas. As a Thelemite, I found that it suggested to me new interpretations of the Book of the Law. After publishing The White Dominican, Meyrink edited a series of occult works by earlier authors, including a German translation of Pascal Beverly Randolph's Dula Bell. His final novel was Der Engel vom Westlichen Fenster. This Angel of the West Window is probably the one most acclaimed among occultists, since it centers on the Elizabethan magus John Dee, and Dee's modern descendant, who is discovering his magical legacy. All of Meyrink's books were freshly translated into English by Mike Mitchell in the 1990s and issued as trade paperbacks in the UK by Daedalus. Dion Fortune received preliminary training in magic from the Irish occultist Theodore Moriarty. She took initiation into the Alpha et Omega successor order to the Golden Dawn, which was then under the leadership of Mina Mathers. Later, Fortune experimented with trance mediumship, by which she claimed to have contacted hidden adepts, and she was subsequently active in theosophical organizing, eventually breaking off to form her own community of the inner light. In the early 1930s, when she had already published her first novel and several other works of magical instruction, she classed herself with Crowley and Israel Regardie as, quote, the unholy trinity of revealers of the mysteries, unquote. Later, she would write, "My novels have a purpose, which is the purpose of initiation." I think we can exclude from this purpose the 3 novels she wrote with the pen name V.M. Steele, since she did not advertise her own authorship of these shallow romantic thrillers. Her first occult novel was The Demon Lover, which she said she had begun to compose simply as a thriller, pure and simple, but which developed a purpose spontaneously in the course of its writing and ended up being a kind of saga of the purification of the soul through initiation. The story begins with a conflict internal to an esoteric order in London and only gradually reaches the country setting where its supernatural phenomena occur. The climax of the book involves an occult rationalization of folkloric monsters, both vampires and werewolves. The Demon Lover puts some magical value on Christian piety, but Fortune's later novels move toward an increasingly pagan perspective. To quote her on her aims in these books, "I decided to produce novels that should come as near to an initiation ceremony as possible. That is to say, that should produce in receptive persons something of the same results as produced by the experience of going through a ritual initiation." These novels are built on a Kabbalistic infrastructure, and they include extracts from Fortune's 2 dramatic rituals that she composed for her Fraternity of the Inner Light. In The Winged Bull and The Goatfoot God, the liturgical elements are drawn from her Rite of Pan, while in the following novels, The Sea Priestess and Moon Magic, the Rite of Isis is involved. The instructional element in these books is never too deep beneath their surface. Although the books contain verbiage and other features of rituals written by Fortune, they are even more focused on the visionary aspects of magical practice, as well as its effect on artistic creativity and interaction with libidinal expression. The magical ambitions of the books make for some unusual pacing. Reviewers have criticized The Sea Priestess for an overlong denouement, but when the essential plot of the book is viewed as a magical operation, it would hardly do to give any briefer treatment to what the protagonist would view as the real result of the work. Gareth Knight has published a short book that includes the full text of the rites of Isis and of Pan, along with an analysis of Fortune's novels and how they relate to her rituals. The book features as appendices a set of a half a dozen papers and addresses by Fortune herself that are relevant to her rites, including several in which she reflects explicitly and at length on her aims in her occult fiction. Occultists on both sides of the Atlantic have contributed to the false notion that H.P. Lovecraft's imaginings have an essential relationship to Thelemic teachings, or at least to a larger tradition of modern magic. The thesis was first advanced in Kenneth Grant's Magical Revival in 1972. Grant knew that Lovecraft was an arch rationalist in no way sympathetic to magical practice, but considered him a quote-unquote natural adept whose dream-based fictions carried esoteric wisdom. Grant thought that Lovecraft knew nothing of Crowley, but the 1991 reissue of the Magical Revival includes a correction citing but not quoting the 1935 letter where Lovecraft wrote, quote, in the 1890s, the fashionable decadents liked to pretend that they belonged to all sorts of diabolic black mass cults and possessed all sorts of frightful occult information. The only specimen of this group still active is the rather over-advertised Aleister Crowley, unquote. Since then, an earlier reference by Lovecraft has come to light in a postcard sent to Clark Ashton Smith. Taking note of Crowley's presence in the US, Lovecraft wrote, "What a queer duck." 5 years after Grant's book appeared, a little New York City cabal, of whom the late brother James Wasserman was the only one courageous enough to use his real name, worked up the Simon Necronomicon, which cites the Magical Revival and transmits notions cooked up by Grant about a Sumerian heritage shared by Crowley and Lovecraft. In Sandy Robertson's 1988 Aleister Crowley scrapbook, there is a single-page chapter with a facing illustration on the alleged Lovecraft-Crowley axis. But just 10 years later, Daniel Harms and John Gauntz wrote a whole book of Necronomicon files in an effort to document the extensive and proliferating adoption of Necronomicons and their attendant great old ones, Shoggoths, and so on among practicing occultists of the late 20th century. Now, I like a bit of Yog-Sothothery as much as the next Pulp Fiction fan, maybe even more, but I don't think that Lovecraft's work belongs in the company of the other books and authors I'm treating here. I just felt I had to include him because of the significant noise around his supposed contributions to the occult. Besides, I'd already mentioned him twice. I don't object to the use of material from his fiction by Satanists and chaos magicians, but I don't see it as having an organic connection to historical streams of initiated wisdom. But wait a moment, what about this? Here we have a still from the 1970 cinematic adaptation of Lovecraft's story, The Dunwich Horror. Dean Stockwell plays the young wizard Wilbur Whately, while Sandra Dee in the foreground there is Nancy Wagner, a love interest slash alter candy who is not in the original story. This film screened 2 years prior to Grant's publication of The Magical Revival. So what's going on here? Well, Dean Stockwell and his friend, Dennis Hopper, had by then been friends of the artist and Thelemite Marjorie Cameron for over a decade. Reportedly, they even spent a while residing at her house. So there's a pretty likely explanation for where Stockwell picked up the attitude of Pan and Bacchus that is the sign of an exempt adept, demonstrated here, along with some of the other impressive ceremonial attitudes that he exhibits in Corman's film. And it wasn't from Lovecraft. That's not Providence we're seeing here, that's Pasadena. And so we must now turn to Southern California. Brother Jack Parsons was an enthusiastic reader of science fiction, and he was especially thrilled by Jack Williamson's 1940 novella, Darker Than You Think. The story features a sorcerer lycanthrope vampire, representing the genetic recrudescence of a pre-human race that has interbred with and become submerged in humanity. These other people are called witches in the story, which might account partly for Parsons' later affinity for the terms witch and witchcraft, despite their forceful rejection by his mentor, Aleister Crowley. The book stands in many ways as a precursor of the Anne Rice formula of anti-horror, in which the sympathetic protagonist is a preterhuman monster at odds with humanity. Particularly like Rice's interview with a vampire, the Williamson story indulges in an initiatory plotline where there is a gradual induction into monsterhood. There's also a thematic and technical correspondence to certain initiations and epiphanies described in Lovecraft stories, where the narrator's horror is compounded by discovering his identity with the object of his fear. Now, I'm afraid I have not read the original novella of Darker Than You Think. I only read the 1948 novel that Williamson expanded it into. But here's the thing. Jack Parsons met Williamson through the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society. Soon after Williamson had written the shorter version, Parsons invited him to attend a Gnostic Mass at Wilfred Smith's Winona Boulevard Church of Thelema, also known as Agape Lodge of O.T.O. So I can't say for sure which features of the larger story are part of Williamson's original inspiration and which may have been the result of his immediate subsequent exposure to Thelema, but the details are certainly provocative. The character of April Bell is the unequivocal scarlet initiatrix of the protagonist, Will Barbie. She is the Babylon who quite literally rides him as a beast, most conspicuously when he takes the form of a huge saber-toothed tiger and carries her naked through the night, an image repeatedly used for illustrations in the various editions of the story. Of course, the names are interesting as well. Will is English for Thelema, and April is the month of the writing of the Book of the Law. Darker Than You Think is full of an apocalyptic tone, embodied most clearly in the imminence of the reign of a witch king called the Child of Night. So this Agape Lodge situation and Jack Parsons' friendship with a cohort of science fiction writers brings us to the final arc of my survey here. Williamson's friend Robert Heinlein was a fan of Cabell's Jurgen, so he must have had a sense of deja vu when Jack Parsons brought him to an Agape Lodge Gnostic Mass. Some years after Parsons' death, Heinlein would use Jack as a model for the character Valentine Michael Smith, a wonder-working cult leader raised by Martians in the novel Stranger in a Strange Land. Aleister Crowley supplied the essence of Smith's adoptive father, the author and Thelemic abbot, Jubal Harshaw. Heinlein never admitted to these sources in so many words, but I consider the circumstantial evidence to be conclusive, and I've worked it out at full length in an earlier presentation, which you can review if you like. It is on YouTube, hosted on the United States Grand Lodge O.T.O YouTube channel. And the title of that one is Strange Angel in a Strange Land. It is my contention that this novel by Heinlein, which mentions Crowley and the Book of the Law explicitly, although only in passing, was a chief means of transmitting Thelemic principles into the post-war 20th century counterculture. Or, as critic William Patterson put it, serving as a seed crystal around which the counterculture constructed itself. While Heinlein was himself not an O.T.O initiate, I view the contents of Stranger in a Strange Land as so very relevant to the Thelemic mysteries that I have yet another presentation on Martian Gnosis and Our Royal Art, which discusses this book exclusively for consideration under the seal of the 5th degree of O.T.O. The earlier Heinlein novel, If This Goes On, was serialized in 1940 in Astounding Science Fiction, and was later combined with a further novella and a short story in the book Revolt in 2100. If This Goes On is set in a not too distant future where the United States is governed by a theocratic tyranny. The hero of the story finds himself falling afoul of the authorities and getting involved with an underground resistance movement that champions individual rights and religious liberty. That cabal is clearly modeled on Freemasonry in both its ideals and its techniques. The 1963 novel that immediately followed Stranger in a Strange Land was Glory Road. It unfortunately fell afoul of a genre-oriented readership that expected science fiction from a writer who had done as much as anyone to define the form in the mid-20th century. Instead, Glory Road most nearly approximates heroic fantasy, although in a subversive, Cabal-esque fashion. If it were to be given a Cabal-style subtitle, Glory Road might well have been called a comedy of vocation. Heinlein's not thoroughly sympathetic protagonist, Easy Gordon, discovers what is needful in order to do that one thing, which is the true purpose of his sojourn, and that makes him a hero. The final arc of Heinlein's literary production was dominated by the World as Myth books, the phrase being introduced in the 1980 novel The Number of the Beast. The metaphysical premise of these books is that mythopoeia is cosmogony. That is, fictional worlds are actual in other dimensions, and that travel among them is possible. In some ways, this just systematizes ideas already introduced in both Stranger and Glory Road. But let's return to a far more this-worldly sort of fiction, and a different line of transmission from The Great Beast. The great literary novel, Under the Volcano, was written by the Englishman Malcolm Lowry in British Columbia, drawing on his experiences in Mexico. It works through the last 12 hours of the life of the consul Geoffrey Furman, offering religious, psychological, moral, political, and magical observations in an aesthetically dense and poetically loaded style. As contrasted with the quiet Thelemic influence on Heinlein, we do have direct written testimony from Lowry regarding the influence of his Canadian neighbor, Crowley's magical son, Charles Stansfeld Jones, on the composition of Under the Volcano. There is a wealth of Kabbalistic and tarot symbolism in this book, derives directly from the instruction Lowry was then receiving from the man who introduced himself as the greatest living Kabbalist. Lowry synthesized his character Furman from his own experiences, mixed with his impressions of Jones. Charles Stansfeld Jones was called by Lowry the mystical original of the council. Again, I have composed a much longer study of this topic, delving into the mutual influences of these two men on one another, and the sense in which each flirted with what he understood as black magic, And this paper appears as the chapter Bizarre Sons in the Success is Your Proof volume, published in 2015 to mark 100 years of O.T.O. in North America. Illuminatus was first published in 1975. The co-authors of this avowed fairy tale for paranoids had worked together as editors at Playboy magazine, where they also published supporting details for the over-the-top psychedelic conspiracy narrative laid out in their fiction. In the sprawling satire, the narrative style shifts perspective constantly. The sex is graphic and detailed, while the violence is mostly at a caricatured remove. I enjoyed these books as a teenager, but was less impressed when I returned to them years later. But the jokes are still funny. There's a large set of appendices intended to provide factual background for the fiction, where Shea and Wilson supply information about Thelemic magic, including many quotes from the Book of Lies. Whether or not the authors intended it as such, Illuminatus became an instrument for Thelemic evangelism, as well as an illustration of the theories of Timothy Leary, and a comic attempt to exceed the complexity of the prose of James Joyce. Now, cultural memory is not exactly in great supply these days, but these books demonstrate that we never needed the internet to create epistemological chaos in our society. Shea and Wilson each went on to write more fiction with conceptual links to Illuminatus. Shea's 1986 novel, All Things Are Lights, is something like a hipper, sexier version of the medieval novels of Sir Walter Scott. Its protagonist is a troubadour and Cathar sympathizer who goes on crusade to Egypt with Louis IX. There are hints here of a great benevolent occult brotherhood, while the foreground is occupied by malicious conspiracies against the hero and the throne of France. I would recommend this one to fans of chivalry and/or heresy. Wilson wrote futurist and esoteric nonfiction, along with parafiction like his Cosmic Trigger books. He also wrote 2 more trilogies to follow Illuminatus. In the Schrodinger's Cat books, he was working somewhat in parallel to Heinlein's World as Myth on the multiple worlds cosmological hypothesis as a basis for fiction. And in his later historical Illuminatus chronicles, starting with The Earth Will Shake, he went back to the 18th century to write conspiracy yarns in the age of Adam Weishaupt and Zanoni. Masks of the Illuminati is a standalone novel with a central role for Aleister Crowley. Now, I said I wouldn't bother with books that merely use Crowley as a character, but it's hard to resist one that uses the O.T.O, especially when real-world consequences followed on it. Besides, Ghost Story is a lovely modern horror novel, admired by Stephen King, among others. In the first hardcover edition only, O.T.O features as a menacing cult. In subsequent editions, the group's name is changed to XXX, once explained as Zala, Zali, or Zlati. Before the book even went to press, some horror fans at Tahuti Lodge in New York found out that Straub was making us into a bugaboo, and they wrote a letter of protest. The letter never reached the author. His editor threw it out. After the book was published, Grand Lodge, under Grady McMurtry, filed a defamation lawsuit. Straub had thought that the Solar Lodge, as presented in Ed Sanders' book on the Manson family, had been the genuine O.T.O and was thus already extinct. So he quickly settled out of court, finding out that there was a completely different group of people who sincerely considered ourselves the O.T.O, and he settled out of court. He agreed to a revision of the book and to some compensation to the order. Now, I've heard different versions of this story. In one of them, the compensation was a modest sum of money, much less, of course, than the suit demanded, which became the original endowment of the O.T.O legal fund. In the other version, which appears to have been the one favored by Straub himself, the author and his publisher split the cost of printing hardware for the O.T.O Grand Lodge. Now, this next book is probably the most popular of all the ones I'll mention today. You know, books are for kids, after all. Die Unendliche Geschichte spent over 2 years at #1 on the German bestseller list, and it has been translated into at least 5 other languages. The book is a tricky one to translate and to physically produce. The English never-ending story runs into the hazards of double translation, since no Thelemite reader can mistake the allusions to Crowley texts. When the hero Bastian gives a name to the childlike empress, it is Mondenkind. Translator Ralph Mannheim serviceably Englishes the name with 2 words, Moonchild. But we know the name should be a single word in English, just as it is in German. The title of Crowley's novel, Moonchild. Even more significantly, the inscription on the amulet Auren is Tu was du willst. Mannheim's do what you wish clearly misses the mark here as well. When discussing the faulty translation of Tu was du willst as do what you dream in the English movie version, the author wrote of the director, Peterson believes that my English may not be enough to recognize that this manages the correct analogous translation of Tu was du willst. He just forgets, although I have told him, that the sentence originally comes from English, namely by the writer Aleister Crowley, and there it says, do what thou wilt. The physical book demands printing in 2 different colors of ink throughout the text, and Enda insisted on other decorative features in the first edition in order to identify the material book with the one that serves as the fantasy portal within the story. Die Unendliche Geschichte features a recursive structure of nested realities where the actual reader of the book becomes part of the magical operation extending through the mundane German boy Bastian into the world of Fantastica. Even with the defects of the English translation, this book is still worth the attention of children and adults. No one would ever mistake Robert Irwin's Satan Wants Me for children's literature. I am a big fan of all this author's fiction, but I had to single out this book in which he weaves a terrific tale of the summer of love under will. A hippie college student in London gets into way more occultism than he bargains for. This story is enchanting, revolting, hilarious, nostalgic, riveting, and pathetic by turns, and the magic, drugs, and weird sex are all pretty credible. Although they get mighty outre. The novel is written in the form of a magical record in obedience to the Black Book Lodge, a persistent old schism of Irwin's invention from Crowley's AA. The journal format is not merely an homage to or an evocation of classic horror fiction like Stoker's Dracula. It is, in fact, a faithful representation of the sort of document that magical practice actually generates. And it time and again inspired me with envy. I wish my own diary were nearly as witty and perceptive as that of Irwin's protagonist. And in that sense, it can and should serve as a goad for working occultists today. Now, I guess that brings me back to my own writing. I had promised to share a sample of my fiction, and I do have one here. So I will pick up in media res. So I'm just opening to the middle of this thing. And here I opened the trunk to find the promised robe, which was black. There was also an unlabeled jar, which had some heft as though it were full of something. I set down the lamp in my hand on the bedside table, and then took off my white robe, folded it carefully, and laid it in the trunk beside the other. Then I removed the jewel from around my neck and set it upon the black robe. I left the trunk open and went to the bed, climbing into the clean, inviting sheets, extinguished the light, and gazed up at the starlight against the distant ceiling. I heard in the distance a rhythmic chanting. There were many voices involved, and although they were not nearby, the sound did not seem to come from any one direction. By the time I focused and tried to make out the words, the chant had ceased. Early morning light was spilling in through the windows above me. I knew that I had slept because I could remember a dream. In it, I had struggled through some sort of muck or quicksand. All my movements were slow and difficult, and I had a sense of thwarted urgency that brought the experience near to nightmare. Finally, I had attained to a shallow pool under a small waterfall where sunlight glinted off the water as it showered me. I saw the filth cleansed from my naked arms and chest, and then the rivulets of the shining water began to form characters as they ran down my limbs, alphabets of Arabic, Cyrillic, Martian, and Thai, ideograms of ancient Egypt and China, exotic number systems, and forms of musical notation. I was filled with a sense of peace and anticipation. Brought back to the awareness of the bed in which I lay, I did not so much ponder this dream as try to recapture the lovely frame of mind into which it had culminated. I closed my eyes and felt a mild thrill, not only at the dream itself, but at the fact that this realm in which I was adventuring was sufficiently real to allow me to pass out of it into dream and then return. I also felt that the dream had somehow validated the earlier ceremonial process of my initiation, and I was excited at the prospect of further engagement with the mysterious and impressive temple in which I had passed the night. A tapping sounded on the door to the chamber. Yes, hello, I called out. The door opened and in walked Columbia. She was wearing the silver collar with a rose from the ceremony and banquet of the night before, but rather than a black robe, she was clad in a white gown, close-fitting in the torso and shot with green in its looser skirt and sleeves. She also wore a green silk scarf on her head, held in place by a delicate silver circlet. In her hands was a large wooden bowl. Following her was a man I did not recognize, in a plain black tunic belted with yellow hose and high black boots. He carried a leather bag in one hand and a sort of indeterminate shape in the other. He had an unconcerned expression on his face. "Good morning, brother," said Columbia to me in a honeyed voice which had already gained my affection. "I hope you are well rested, because it is time for you to rise. I have the privilege of readying you for certain duties that our sister Peristera wishes you to perform." She seemed both grave about her intentions and amused at me. For my part, I was somewhat discomfited, covered only by a sheet, and unsure how to respond. The man stepped forward and placed in the center of the floor the object he had been carrying, which turned out to be a largish pillow. Columbia, meanwhile, placed the bowl on the table. As I sat up, I saw that it appeared to be full of water. Columbia instructed me to kneel on the pillow, which I did promptly, not giving a thought to my nakedness until I was comfortably settled. The man placed a cloth upon my shoulders and said, "I trust you will not object to a tonsure, brother?" This query came as a surprise to me, but I gave my assent. The man showed himself to be a very capable and efficient barber. In a matter of some 10 minutes, he had used the razor and other tools in his bag to shave my head entirely bare. Any misgivings I might have had about the effect of this operation were assuaged by Columbia, who told me that I looked very dignified. Columbia then washed my head, using the bowl of water she had brought. She directed me to stand and continued to wash me from head to foot. After drying me with a cloth handed to her by the barber, she retrieved the black robe from the chest and presented it to me. I put it on. Then she bade me kneel once more. Returning to the trunk, she produced the jar, which she opened. She stood before me and brought forth from the jar a balm of some sort. Its odor was strong, but not unpleasant. After dividing the portion between her hands, she applied it to my head, anointing the entirety of my newly exposed scalp. She worked carefully, while slowly and quietly she incanted, "Qui nocet noceat adhuc, et qui in sordibus et sordescat adhuc, et justus justitiam faciat adhuc, et sanctus sanctificator adhuc." I was not surprised to feel a tingling sensation from the balm. The man pulled aside the tapestry to reveal an open doorway leading into a dark passage. Raising her voice, Columbia exhorted me, "Rise, my brother, and by thy work gain the god. Veni et vidi." I stood and replied to her, "And I shall come and see. Even I, Lucius Onorio, a stranger in this strange land, yea, even I, the man, shall behold this wonder." Without hesitation, I passed into the opening, and the tapestry was dropped behind me, plunging me into darkness. Well, I could go on, because it is a whole book. However, I will stop. And I have, I should mention that I have been recently informed that my books are likely to become more expensive, because I publish them through print on demand. And the costs are going up. So anybody interested in anybody happens to be interested in them, I should let you know that there's a window of just a few weeks before prices may change. So buy now and save. And so, as not to conclude on that note, but on the one that I always prefer, love is the law. Love under will.